This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Human Action Podcast. Today in this episode, I am going to cover the economics of slavery, particularly in the tradition of Ludwig von Mises. And what we're going to end up arguing is that contrary to the claims of people writing for the 1619 Project, for example, and fresh on the heels of Juneteenth, the institution of slavery was propped up by the government. That's going to be my claim in this episode. And that laissez-faire capitalism, left to its own devices, unfettered free markets, would have quickly abolished slavery, even if for some reason that institutional framework had been dropped in the lap of an otherwise free market. All right, so that's what we're going to cover in this episode. The motivation's actually not because of the recent Juneteenth anniversary, but rather I've been talking with my son about these issues, and it was just a coincidence. So I thought this would be good fodder for a Human Action Podcast episode. So first, let me just read some passages from Human Action, which is Mises' magnum opus, because this really changed the way I looked at it. Obviously, as a young boy, I was taught that slavery was a monstrous moral crime. And of course, everybody nowadays who's a decent person understands that and agrees with that claim. But what Mises pointed out in Human Action is that not only is slavery immoral, but it's actually inefficient. And that slavery can only persist if the government gives it advantages vis-a-vis free labor. All right, so let me just read some passages from Mises, and then we'll kind of spend the rest of this episode unpacking and clarifying what his position is. So this is coming from page 625 and 26 of the Scholars Edition version of Human Action. The abolition of slavery and serfdom is to be attributed neither to the teachings of theologians and moralists, nor to weakness or generosity on the part of the masters. There were among the teachers of religion and ethics as many eloquent defenders of bondage as opponents. Servile labor disappeared because it could not stand the competition of free labor. Its unprofitability sealed its doom in the market economy. All right, now let me just pause for a second and point out, elsewhere Mises had observed that slavery in various forms had existed for millennia. All right, and it really only disappeared from the earth when the Industrial Revolution swept, the advanced economies, and that's really what gave rise to the legions of free workers. Okay, that's really what spelled the end of slavery. Okay, so again, in terms of like the historical explanations, that it's a bit weird to blame, capitalism for exploitation and abusing workers and thinking that, oh yeah, the United States was built on slavery and that's kind of the epitome of market capitalism for you, when no, throughout history, you had slavery in various forms of, indentured servitude and bondage. And it really was only with the rise of what we now call capitalism, the market economy, that really got wiped away. Okay, but now back to Mises. The price paid for the purchase of a slave is determined by the net yield expected from his employment, both as a worker and as a progenitor of other slaves, just as the price paid for a cow is determined by the net yield expected from its utilization. Now, let me just mention something, folks. Some, probably not the listeners of the Human Action Podcast, who are tuned into economics and are familiar with unorthodox views, but the average person, hearing this is going to recoil and say, "Whoa, you're treating somebody like an animal, like a barnyard animal. That's crazy." But the point is, right, that's what happens under slavery. That's, viewing human beings as if they were farm animals. And notice the principles Mises is going to lay out. That's going to explain why he's saying, yes, even on its own terms, slavery doesn't make sense. It's an inefficient system. And so even looking at it purely in a cost-benefit framework, you'll see that it doesn't make sense, and it would have collapsed under its own weight had it not been propped up by government. So back to Mises. The owner of a slave does not pocket a specific revenue. For him, there is no, quote, exploitation boon derived from the fact that the slave's work is not remunerated and that the potential market price of the services he renders is possibly greater than the cost of feeding, sheltering, and guarding him. He who buys a slave must in the price paid make good for these economies as far as they may be expected. He pays for them in full, due allowance being made for time preference. Okay, so let me just make sure you're getting what Mises is saying. He's saying the fact that, what you might think of as, the reason slavery, quote, works and is profitable to the slave master, they say, because you've got these human beings who are generating a certain amount of output, right? If you had to pay them fair market wages for their their output, you would be paying them more than what you're implicitly paying, when they're slaves, in terms of like how much do you feed them, because you got to feed them, otherwise they're going to die. You got to give them some shelter and so on. So the point being that you might think that, yes, slavery is very profitable to the slave master, to the owners of the plantations, because they don't have to pay the workers the full amount that they would have to pay free laborers who did the same work. And so they pocket that difference, net of the costs of upkeep and whatnot. But Mises is saying, no, the boon there, that gap, that exploitation boon doesn't accrue directly to the slave master because they had to pay a price for those slaves at the auction block, right? And when people were auctioning off the slaves, the people bidding on them were taking into account, they were looking ahead and doing calculations and thinking, okay, yeah, these guys on my plantation, this is how, the amount of cotton they would harvest or whatever it is they're doing, and I could sell it for this much, okay, then I got to pay to, and also you got to pay for people with whips and riding on horseback looking around, and you got to build fences and things to keep them in, right? So there's all these things considered, and that guides how much are you willing to pay at the auction for the slave. So the point that there's that gap per se is not accruing to the person who owns the slave on a day-to-day basis and has them going out and doing work in the field, right? Because that was already taken into account when you bought the slave in the first place. Okay, back to Mises. He who buys a slave must in the price paid make good for these economies as far as they may be expected. He pays for them in full, due allowance being made for time preference. Whether the proprietor employs the slave in his own household or enterprise or rents his services to other people, he does not enjoy any specific advantage from the existence of the institution of slavery. The specific boon goes totally to the slave hunter. In other words, the man who deprives free men of their liberty and transforms them into slaves. But of course, the profitability of the slave hunter's business depends upon the height of the prices buyers are ready to pay for the acquisition of slaves. If these prices drop below the operation and transportation costs incurred in the business of slave hunting, business no longer pays and must be discontinued. Okay, so Mises is saying, even on its own terms, at best, the boon of slavery is really concentrated, in the ranks of those who were going around and capturing, formerly free men and then going and selling them down the line to other people who then, might take them across the ocean and sold them. Okay, so again, when we're trying to understand, what's the benefit of slavery, it's not to be found in the fact that, the slave produces more than the costs necessary for his upkeep. That the plantation owner already took that into account when paying an original purchase price for the slave. Okay, back to Mises. Now, at no time and at no place was it possible for enterprises employing servile labor to compete on the market with enterprises employing free labor. Servile labor could always be utilized only where it did not have to meet the competition of free labor. If one treats men like cattle, one cannot squeeze out of them more than cattle-like performances. But it then becomes significant that man is physically weaker than oxen and horses, and that feeding and guarding a slave is, in proportion to the performance to be reaped, more expensive than feeding and guarding cattle. When treated as a chattel, man renders a smaller yield per unit of cost expended for current sustenance and guarding than domestic animals. If one asks from an unfree laborer human performances, one must provide him with specifically human inducements. If the employer aims at obtaining products which in quality and quantity excel those whose production can be extorted by the whip, he must interest the toiler in the yield of his contribution. Instead of punishing laziness and sloth, he must reward diligence, skill, and eagerness. But whatever he may try in this respect, he will never obtain from a bonded worker, in other words, a worker who does not reap the full market price of his contribution, a performance equal to that rendered by a free man, in other words, a man hired on the unhampered labor market. The upper limit beyond which it is impossible to lift the quality and quantity of the products and services rendered by slave and serf labor is far below the standards of free labor. In the production of articles of superior quality, an enterprise employing the apparently cheap labor of unfree workers can never stand the competition of enterprises employing free labor. It is this fact that has made all systems of compulsory labor disappear. Okay, so that's, for those who are familiar with Mises' general worldview, that's very consistent with other elements of his thought. All right, that Mises, for example, says that the reason we have widespread cooperation, the reason that people live in large cities together and that we have general peace among people, it's not because of the teachings of religion. That he's saying no, and it's not also just, that's just natural or something. And Mises thinks that no, that ultimately flows from the higher productivity of the division of labor. That people, it's an empirical fact, and then people have come to recognize this, and their institutions and practices and whatever correspond with this, that Mises is saying social bonds make sense given the higher productivity of labor when, tasks are divided, when you engage in the division of labor, that some people specialize in being dentists and some people specialize in growing the food and some people specialize in building houses. And if you do that, we can get more dental services and more houses and more food per person than if everyone tried to do every little thing themselves. Okay, but given that you're going to do that and people are going to specialize and then trade with each other, you have to have a general respect for property rights. That's the only way that kind of a system can work. All right, and so if you're willing to refrain from aggression, then you can live in harmony with others, population can grow, and then we can all reap the benefits of specialization and trading. Okay, so one particular example of that overall viewpoint comes to the issue of slavery, where Mises is saying it is very inefficient that to have people locked up in that mode of production, in the long run, you're not getting as much production out of them compared to a situation where they're free. And so that's, for him, that's ultimately why slavery doesn't make sense, and that was relegated to the dustbin of history once capitalism is unleashed. Okay, so that's his position. And let me just now spend the rest of this episode clarifying a few points and then trying to do some thought experiments to make that more compelling, in case at first, you're hearing that and you're thinking, yeah, that sounds nice, but come on, that doesn't square with, my understanding of history. Okay, so first of all, and I've seen this when, reading a lot of the arguments people were having when that 1619 project came out, people were talking a lot about slavery. Some people misunderstood what the claim is. All right, so Mises there, he's not saying, for example, that, the United States in the South in the year 1800, if all of the slaves one day just disappeared, that production would be higher. Obviously, he's not saying that. The claim is rather that if you looked at the total economic output of the United States as of, let's say, 1850, that had the slaves all been free workers starting in the year 1800, that the total output of the United States would be much higher in the year 1850 than it otherwise was. Okay, so that is the bedrock claim, that the amount of goods and services produced by a group of people in general, again, especially if you do it in the long run, is going to be higher if they are free than if they're slaves. And partly, and so there's lots of reasons for that. So part of it is simply that the type of work you can expect from a slave, there has to be various characteristics. So for one thing is you have to be able to monitor them, right? Because otherwise they're going to run away. So it's got to be a thing where you can kind of, keep track. You have to pay people to watch them. You have to, build fences or whatever. And then also too, in many respects, you can't give them too much initiative, right? That for one thing, they might plot against, try to get free, but also you got to kind of keep things very homogeneous and just say, here's the task, here's what you have to do. Because if it's too open-ended, then it's too hard to know what to expect. Okay, to give an idea what I mean, it wouldn't make sense to say to a group of people, hey, go invent a light bulb. And if you don't, we're going to whip you. That's not going to work, right? The way to get Edison to, invent the light bulb as we know it, the system that produces that has to be one of open entry and freedom of experimentation. And then, and if you hit something, it's your property, you get to keep it. That's the way to get innovation, right? Because again, you don't know who the inventors are going to be, right? So that's perhaps a contrived example, but I'm just trying to make the point that slave labor, to the extent that it's useful at all, that can do anything, it really has to be confined to very narrowly defined tasks where it's pretty clear this is how much you're capable of. Because again, just even to set the thresholds to say, something going and picking cotton, just to pick an obvious cliched example, to say at what point do you whip the person or not? Because under slavery you can use corporal punishments like that you wouldn't use under system of free labor. Under free labor, the worst you do is just lay somebody off and say you can't work here anymore. It's kind of interesting. Under slavery, the oppression is that you're overworking the slaves. You're asking them to do too much. Whereas like the Marxist complaint about capitalism is like, the workers can't find a job. They're standing outside the factory saying, please let me work. And they're saying, no, we don't need you. Right. So it is interesting how, one's complaint about the social institution changes based on the particulars, but it's always, the people are upset about the people running the show. Okay. So yes, there's scope for corporal punishment under slavery, and historically we can certainly see that's what people resorted to. But I'm saying, even if you go and analyze that, and again, just put aside the obvious, revulsion at, the idea of whipping somebody just because they're not doing what you say, that's wrong. Yes, it is. But beyond that, in terms of running a business that's not very productive, you don't have very many options at that point. And here's what I mean. You've got a group of people and you're going to have them go out and pick a crop, and you're willing to use whips and whatever to motivate them. Okay. But you can't have the same rule applying to everybody, whether it's a 20-year-old man in apparently good health versus a 20-year-old woman who's 8 months pregnant versus an 80-year-old woman who's got a broken leg. Do you see what I mean? Or a 7-year-old kid, right? The point is, when you're setting the thresholds at which you're going to use corporal punishment, you would have to tailor it to the particular individual. Otherwise, you're going to be way too onerous for some people, and that's counterproductive, or not onerous enough for other people. All right. And so I'm saying, but even when you allow for that, just looking at people who look identical, some of them might just be better workers than others. And so, but if you just set a bare minimum and say, this is what you got to do or else you get punished physically, well, then under a slave system, everyone's just going to do the bare minimum to avoid punishment. And so there's natural variation in the abilities of workers, and they're not volunteering that. Okay. And so that's one way of seeing the inefficiency of slavery, is that it doesn't, the people who are more productive or have the capability of becoming more productive, perhaps over time, they have no incentive to develop their skills, and they certainly aren't going to volunteer that. Whereas in a capitalist market economy, where you get to keep the fruits of your labor, then you do have the incentive. If you're a more productive worker, you can show it, and then you can shop around and try to get an employer who's going to, bid you away because, look, this guy's producing more. Right? Whereas under a slave system, once you're somebody else's property and legally they're entitled to everything you produce, what incentive do you have to produce more? That's just going to go to your owner. Why would you do that? All right. So that's the argument. So let me now move on to an interesting thought experiment to really push the limits to show why, once you're thinking of it like this, it's crystal clear to me, at least, that under laissez-faire capitalism, slavery as an institution is doomed. And let me stack the deck against my thesis. All right, so let's just suppose in the year 1800, everybody in the United States reads somehow like Murray Rothbard's For a New Liberty, gets into their hands somehow. There's a time machine or whatever. Okay, and everybody is convinced. Okay, and so the United States, as of 1800, flips over to full-blown anarcho-capitalism. However, I don't want to just quote cheat and just say, oh, and therefore in the new legal arrangements, they recognize that slavery is immoral and therefore all the slaves are freed on day one. Let's make it harder. And also, I think it'll be more instructive to go this route. Let's say that the way the property titles work, just like the people who owned, cattle and farmland and plantations, like the actual buildings and stuff, the day before the Great Epiphany, when everyone read Rothbard, all those titles presumably largely transfer over. Right? There'd be weird stuff about like government buildings and stuff like that. But in terms of private property titles, nobody disputes that, oh yeah, that cow right there is Jim's cow, and he bought it fair and square. There's never been any allegations that he stole it from anybody. And that house right there, that's been in that family for 6 generations. Yeah, that's their house. That's no one's disputing that. Okay, so the standard property title is switching over, that now it's not a government judge and government police and whatever that would enforce your property rights. It's now, decentralized anarcho-capitalist institutions, the judges rendering opinions using, libertarian legal principles. There's different competing protection agencies that rely upon the community's understanding of the property titles to enforce, property rights, all that stuff, as Rothbard spelled out. Okay, so I'm saying, let's just suppose after that transition occurs and everything's ANCAP, that as a general principle out of conservatism, that the human beings who were the property of other human beings the eve before the awakening, on the day after the Great Awakening, that's still the status quo. Because they just think it's, some people might feel queasy about it, but they just like, this is the easiest way to do the transition. Okay? Now, I think, so I'm going to argue, is that would not be a stable equilibrium, right? I'm going to show or make the case that even if that's what you thought happened on day 2 of the libertarian awakening, that would not be the long run landing point. Okay, so I'm trying to show slavery does not survive in a system of full-blown property rights, even if you assume at the outset that the property rights in principle could mean that some human beings own the bodies of other human beings and are entitled to anything those bodies produce in terms of goods and services. Okay? So that's what I'm going to try to argue. I think even trying to load the deck against myself there, the people will have to grant slave hunting would clearly be illegal in the new system, right? That if we make the transition and we're saying, yeah, somebody who was a slave on T-1 is still a slave on T+1, right? That we're not just going to arbitrarily just start rearranging property titles. And if, that plantation owner, the local judge and everybody, the community kind of thought he owned those 100 people last week, so this week we're going to assume that's how things start. Still, somebody, people in other countries who had nothing to do with the white man last week, clearly if someone goes and captures them physically, puts chains on them and brings them over and tries to sell them at an auction, the libertarian judges say, what the heck are you doing? You don't have proper title to those people. What are you doing? You can't do that. Just like if people went and grabbed somebody's stagecoach and brought over and tried to sell it, and they say, wait, are you the lawful owner of that? And if you couldn't prove title, then he said, you can't do that. Those are stolen goods. Okay, so I'm saying whether the British had already stopped the transatlantic trade or whatever, that I'm saying if the U.S. goes ANCAP, there's no more importation of newly captured slaves, right? Like the libertarian court system would not recognize that would clearly be aggression. Okay, so I think we've contained the problem in that sense right there. That I'm saying under pure capitalism, somebody who starts out as free, you can't just go capture the person and say, now you're my slave. That's clearly out of the bounds, and it would be ridiculous for a Marxist or someone to argue that, oh yeah, that's capitalism for you. That whatever you want to call that system, that's not libertarianism run amok. Okay. But like I say, let's now tackle the harder challenge, which one could more plausibly say is that, you're not allowed libertarians to just say a priori, people nowadays don't like slavery, so that can't happen under our system just by definition. That no, you got to show how would market forces eliminate. So let's do that. Okay, so again, on day 2 of the revolution, a bunch of people happen to be considered legally owned by some other group. What happens? Okay, so before I tackle that, let's first change gears for a bit and just in general think about, in a market economy, what sorts of principles guide where the property titles reside. All right. So in general, I want to say what principles in a market economy determine who owns the pieces of property. So for example, think about a car, and there's different models, and some cars are part of a fleet that gets rented out, and other cars are owned by, the people that drive them on a daily basis. And so why is that the case? Well, and it depends on the circumstances. And so if you're going to be someone, you want to take a particular vehicle and drive it around, and you want to always have it at your beck and call, and you're going to maintain physical possession of it for a long stretch, 6 months at a time, it would be crazy for you to just keep renting it and rolling it over with the company, budget or enterprise or whoever, because among other things, there's maintenance that goes into running a car correctly. All right. And so if you're renting a car, you're not going to go change the oil. You're going to, put gas in it because you need it to keep it running. But I'm pretty sure most of you listening to this have never had a rental car and decided to take it in and get the oil changed and the tires rotated, right? You don't do that, right? Because you're just using it temporarily. Okay, so that's just one example of the kind of thing I mean. Or a different example, if you're renting a house, all right? You and your family, you're living in a 3-bedroom, 2-story house, got a nice yard and things like that. That can make sense, and there are, I've done that. There's people that will do that. But if you're planning on staying at that place for a long time, it would make more sense for you to buy it. Or looking the other way, if you're renting a house, you're not going to do something like go plant a tree or, build a deck on the back if you're just renting, right? And why is that? Is because you don't have the right to partake in the long run, economic benefits of those decisions, right? That if you're just renting it and technically the owner could come along and maybe they have to give you 30 days notice or something, but you don't, if you do something that makes the house's value $10,000 more over the next few years, that doesn't accrue to you in any way. All right. So I'm saying in general, in the market economy, there's a tendency that the property titles end up in the hands of those whose actions can influence the market value of the asset in question, right? The people who have the most influence over the value of something and stand to gain if their actions raise its value, or stand to lose if their actions deplete its value. Those are the ones that in general, it makes sense to be the owners, right? And so just as, somebody's uncle dies and he leaves them, leaves the nephew a bunch of cattle that are in Texas somewhere. And this kid lives in Chicago. He's like, oh, your uncle died and now you own all this cattle down in Texas. He's probably not going to maintain ownership of it. He's probably just going to sell it to somebody else down there who's going to take care of them and figure out the best thing to do with them. And he's just going to sell it for, quote, the market price, right? It doesn't make sense for him to maintain ownership of those animals, right? for various reasons. Okay. And so what I'm saying is now that kind of warmed you up to this idea that somebody could initially start out with some property and be the legal owner of something, but it just doesn't make any economic sense for that person to stay the owner, right? Just like if your uncle dies and leaves you a house in Philadelphia and you live in Chicago, maybe in the beginning you rent it out, you contact some agency or whatever, and they find tenants and they, do the maintenance and whatever and send you the net earnings. But unless for some reason you as an investor wanted to get into the Philadelphia real estate market, you probably don't want to keep that. It probably makes a lot more economic sense for you just to sell that thing to somebody else who's in a different circumstance, right? Who has the right incentives to really get the most out of that property compared to what you can do in Chicago. And, this thing kind of fell in your lap. All right. So that's, the kind of framework I'm starting with here. I'm going to say now in that spirit, then I want to claim that in general, in the market economy, what person is the most likely economically sensible owner of a particular body? That person. That's what makes the most economic sense when there's the, jostling in the marketplace and people are making offers and counter offers and there's different efficiencies and different considerations going on and incentives, The person that it makes the most sense to own Jim Smith's body is Jim Smith. And so even if we started out on day 2 after the Libertarian Epiphany with Jim Smith's body is technically owned by Joe Brown, that over time market forces would lead to deals in which Jim Smith bought that title and that he ended up being now the legal owner. Okay, so how would that, play out? And there's different ways of running through it. So here, I'll just be real quick on this. Is at the very bare minimum, you could say, all right, somebody establishes a plantation that's run on free labor. And so that, person just pays market wages to attract workers. And then notice there's certain cost savings that plantation could enjoy vis-a-vis its competitor a mile away that's based on slave labor. So among other things, they don't have to have surveillance. They don't have to, employ a bunch of guys on horses with whips punishing people. No, they just say, come do the work. And if you don't, then you get fired. We don't pay you. All right. So they maybe have to have a few people just monitoring to see what's going on. But other than that, it's not nearly as much overhead to have that system up and running. But also, they can do things like have different incentive structures and just say, hey, we'll pay you based on, how much you collect. And so you can come and, for every 10 bushels you pick, we'll let you keep such and such. And so that way, the people have the incentive, the people who are the most productive can go ahead and exert themselves to the fullest because they're getting paid in proportion to what they do. Okay, so there's that element as well, that if you had, the same workers transporting them or put it this way, for sure, the most productive workers on the slave plantation that's a mile away, if they could be identified and taken and dropped off at the free plantation, then they would produce more stuff. All things considered, right? That because they would yield more than they were at the other place because back at the other place they were just doing the bare minimum to avoid punishment. So here they can exert themselves more. And out of that harvest now, the owner in the free plantation setting doesn't have to also pay the overseers and the people with the whips and everything to monitor because these people are there of their own volition. Okay, so that's just one way of kind of seeing Mises' point about slave labor. Enterprises based on slave labor can't withstand competition from, free labor. But beyond that, I think really, that's just scratching the surface. But more generally, you say, oh, there's plenty of people, in the original, slave setting that surely in the United States of America, there are other occupations where some of those people could generate more output per day of their work than staying where they are as, slaves on a plantation in the South somewhere. And so, maybe that means they go north to Chicago or go to New York City or wherever and work in factories or who knows what. Maybe those who are particularly inclined to do so go and they study, and they become accountants or they, go into law or whatever. Okay. There's all sorts of, maybe some go up and open a business, right? All sorts of things you can, maybe they go and get a little plot of land and they're just, free farms and just, a little homestead. And the idea is just overall, over the course of years, how much more would they produce, economically speaking, in terms of dollars, transform their output into how much do you sell in the marketplace, and to say, what are the chances that their labor tied to those particular occupations that could work under slavery, whereas again, a lot of these other ones, it just wouldn't work to run the enterprise on a slave system. What are the chances that that's the best use of their labor? Okay, so once you open up that possibility that, maybe there's other avenues where they could earn more, well, then it becomes clear, like economically speaking, if the slave could generate more economic rent, if that's the term you want to use, by switching their location and going somewhere else, there's like money on the table there that implicitly the slave, especially if he values his freedom, would be able, if somebody could just lend him the money, he could pay, buy his freedom from his former master and then go somewhere else and then earn more, higher wage per hour implicitly than he was implicitly before. And that's how he could pay off the loan. All right. Just like, how does the student loan market work? You got some kid with skills who would make a great surgeon, but right now, he just has the aptitude and whatever. He doesn't have all the formal training and experience. And so, let's say he doesn't have a lot of money. So yes, if he could just go to regular, college, then go to medical school, then do his internship, residency and all this stuff. And eventually he's going to be a brain surgeon making $400,000 a year. But how do we get from here to there? Somebody has to bankroll him. And that's how student loans work. And that would be a much more rational market, in an anarcho-capitalist society than it is right now, with all sorts of government distortions at various levels, both in the loan market and, on the college campuses. Okay. So that's that basic model where people, lend up front for you to get training or whatever, so that you can enhance your earning ability. And then down the road, you pay the loan off. I'm saying that principle could work, in our hypothetical thought experiment where the entire United States went anarcho-capitalist in the year 1800. Okay. And so again, that it's the point being is once you are at least open to the idea that slave labor is inherently inefficient and that free laborers can produce more, particularly, again, if you allow for the passage of time, right? That I can imagine, saying, yeah, it's not that the guy who's his whole life grown up on a plantation being a slave, just, picking certain types of agricultural products, you can't just grab him and drive him to a factory and now he's going to be making machine parts and earning more per hour next Thursday. Like maybe he needs to get trained and whatever. But still, if you're talking about somebody young, he's got his whole life ahead of him. And if you're allowing for the flexibility and to say, could they, given enough time, acquire skills in a free industry, wouldn't they earn more? And I think when you start thinking through all the issues with slave labor, that in general, you could definitely earn more given enough time. And so once you open that possibility, then it's like, okay, so that means there's prima facie a win-win exchange available where, some capitalist fronts the money to buy the person's freedom and then he pays the person back. Okay, let me mention there is a bit of slippage in that. One of the big problems is presumably one of the main things that former slaves would do is consume more leisure. All right. So if it weren't for the disutility of labor, this case would be straightforward. It would just be like the former slaves could easily just do the same thing they were doing before. And then if they just had a little bit of a premium they placed on their own autonomy, they were willing just to, so like if their services were worth as much to the slave run plantation versus they go down the street to somebody else who pays them market wages and they literally produce the same amount and just do the same activities, but now just get paid for it. And then, they were willing just to take a little haircut on that in order to have a margin and then, because they just like being free. That would be straightforward. The problem is the reason it would be intellectually dishonest to just make it sound like that's the whole issue is that in general, slaves work a lot more than they would if they're free. All right. And so even though, put it this way, I think it's a slam dunk to say in general, especially if you have more time to work with, a particular human being's output per hour is higher if they're a free worker and they can choose their occupation and get training and whatever. There is the issue of if you're a slave, you're probably going to work a lot more hours per week than if you're a free worker. Okay, so there is that element in terms of the economics. One way of putting it is to say, given your higher income potential as a free worker, you quote spend some of that in the form of more leisure hours, right? So like the opportunity cost of your leisure is higher now because you could work at a higher wage per hour, given that you're free, but you choose to consume some of that by working less. Okay. So there's nothing wrong with that choice, but I am saying in terms of the rest of society, looking at a group of former slaves who now become free, that would be one offsetting thing, that if they choose to not work as many hours per week, then the rest of the rest of planet Earth would look at, we're getting less output from them on that margin. And then the question, it's an empirical question just to say, okay, but even though they're working fewer hours per week now because they're doing different things that are more productive, on net, what's the balance? Okay. And so that's the general case I would make. And I want to say, it's ultimately empirical. Like here, I didn't just, prove it slam dunk. Therefore, that has to be the outcome. But I think especially if you start saying bringing in multiple generations, then the idea that this original group of people whose bodies were legally the property of some other group, and just to say that's just going to continue and their kids are going to be like that and their grandkids and so on, I just think is crazy. That no, the economics are so stacked against that over time, I do think those property titles would eventually, revert more and more to, the individuals in question. Okay. And then one last point on this train of thought, and then I'll deal with some objections. Even if you do think there's this margin where you'd say, yes, the former slave would be short. Like, yeah, they might be able to pledge a large portion of their income to say, hey, to some outside capitalist, if you can pay off, you're basically giving me a big loan implicitly and pay off somebody else, my former owner, so I can go take a job somewhere else that's based on, place based on free labor. And then, I'll pay you off over time and, you are a decent rate of return on your capital. Suppose that it doesn't quite work because again, the person's not willing to work as hard. Even if they intended to, because you might say, well, but if they have the looming prospect of their freedom, wouldn't they do it? But still, you could just see how realistically that no, if I'm here and I'm being beaten if I don't do something, and then to go somewhere else and just know, hey, you owe this guy some money and you don't want your credit to get ruined. Like the incentives aren't there to work as hard, especially if it involves years of backbreaking toil. So there's this mismatch. Okay, still though, let's let's just say, though, that, there's a 10% mismatch or whatever. If there's a bunch of people in the society who find it very distasteful that some human beings are legally owned by others, they're allowed to contribute to that. They could contribute to a fund that helps liberate them. Because again, I think it's crystal clear under an anarcho-capitalist legal framework, slave hunting wouldn't be legal. That would just be clearly theft, aggression. And so the issue, we just have a finite number of slaves on day 2. And then the issue, once you liberate them one by one, then, that's, you're chipping away at the problem. And so I think, among other things, it would be pretty easy to have a system where people who find it distasteful, how do they help? They contribute to a fund that goes around and augments those deals and closes the gaps to make sure that something that, it's not quite a slam dunk there, but no, they come in and they sweeten it by throwing in some money to grease the wheels and make the deal go through. And if you want to say, I can imagine some critics saying, oh no, that wouldn't work. Or how do we? Okay, well, if you're in a society where no one's even willing to kick in some money like that, you don't solve it by saying, so instead of doing that, why don't we have a society where people form a government and then they have a bloody civil war where hundreds of thousands of people get killed? No, that's way more expensive, right? So if the people are willing to have a huge civil war to free the slaves, it would be way cheaper to, contribute to help the slaves buy their own freedom. All right, that's the point. Last thing I'll say is you might, hearing all this, that all sounds good in theory, but, the U.S. was pretty laissez-faire, especially back in the day. Why couldn't these market forces have kicked in? And the reason is, or some of the reasons, are that there were government impediments. All right, so we actually did not have laissez-faire capitalism in 1800. So, for example, there were various laws restricting the ability of an owner to teach his slaves how to read and write. Okay, so notice this was not at all laissez-faire capitalism, property rights for the win, do whatever you want. No, this was benevolent, paternalistic government intervention saying, you might think that you own those human beings over there, but we're going to restrict what you can do with your own property. Okay, because clearly in some settings, it would be in the interest of the owner to teach some of his slaves, particularly like the ones that are teaching his kids or something, maybe to go to town and do some business on his behalf, to teach them things. But yet, again, in some places, it was against the rules. You weren't allowed to teach your slaves to read and write. And you can see why they would do that, like as a community, that, we don't want them getting funny ideas and having an uprising. But notice there, it's like the collective versus the individual. Also, in some places, there were rules against manumission, right? So even the plantation owner on his deathbed in his will might want to free some of his slaves or, his most trusted confidants and whatnot. And in some places that was just literally illegal. You couldn't do that. All right. So that's another huge intervention. And then also, perhaps most important, is a lot of the costs of maintaining slavery were socialized. So there are things like slave patrols, right? So you're a plantation owner, you have some slaves run away, you call the local authorities, and they send out, whites who are not slave owners, who just are in the community, and they have a slave patrol, and they go capture the guy and bring him back and deliver your property to you. And that's kind of like the government expense, just like in general, oh, geez, somebody broke into your house and stole something, and the police go try to find the guy, the taxpayers cover that cost of that investigation and whatnot. So likewise here. And then more famously, of course, the Fugitive Slave Acts, where even northern states were compelled to use their resources to return, quote, stolen property to the people in the South. So all that stuff under anarcho-capitalism wouldn't fly. No, if your cattle wanders off, you don't have the ability to compel people, your neighbors who have nothing to do with it, to go get your cattle back and bring them back to you free of charge, and the community just pays for that. That doesn't happen, right? So again, lots of reasons that actually government was involved at various steps in historical slavery in the United States, which is partly why some of these market forces that I've been sketching were not fully brought to bear. So in conclusion, I would say far from being hand in glove with capitalism, slavery and capitalism are polar opposites, and it actually took government intervention to prop up the inefficient institution of slavery. And this was all flowing out of the pen of Ludwig von Mises. This is how he viewed the world. Thanks for your attention, everybody. See you next time.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.